So, Grant, one of the estate planning tactics I have in mind used to be used a lot. We would see it all the time in an effort to reduce estate tax or potentially, absolutely eliminate it in some cases. And so, would you talk about a little bit what a bypass trust is, and then we might get into a little bit of conversation about portability and why the bypass trust is not quite as used these days.
Sure, and I think it's good to contrast the two, and great to start off with the bypass trust. So, you'll hear the terms bypass trust or credit shelter trust, but let me walk through a little bit of an example here. We talked about the lifetime exemption amount. Currently, it's approximately 14 million for an individual or 28 million for a married couple. So, on the date of the first to die, nothing happens really at the first death. I think that's important to highlight. All the assets can pass. I'm speaking generally on a simplified case, but generally all assets pass to the surviving spouse through the unlimited marital deduction. So the bypass trust was a tool that was utilized historically a lot to capture or to mitigate estate taxes on the death of the second to die. But essentially what would happen is the estate plan would be structured so that on the first to die, they would fund the bypass trust with up to whatever that lifetime exemption amount was, unreduced by or reduced by any historic gifts that had been made. But regardless, if no historic substantial gifts had been made that would have limited or pulled back the lifetime exemption, that exemption amount would fund the trust. And so at the death of the second spouse to die, the survivor would apply his or her lifetime exemption to the remaining assets, and the first to die would have captured their full exemption amount when the trust was funded. And, once that happened, all future growth on those assets would also have been excluded, which we'll talk more about that in a minute at the date of the second to die. That's the basic premise and what the credit shelter or bypass trust was used for.
And then in 2010, we had this portability thing come up, and it's really interesting. I mean, the portability, you also sometimes hear it called DSU, or the deceased spouse's unused exemption. Essentially, what the IRS said is if one spouse, the first to die, has unused exemption left over, you can port that over, and the surviving spouse can use it. And so essentially, there wasn't as much need to establish with the first spouse to die the credit shelter trust or the bypass trust, because each one of the spouses could get the full benefit of the exemption. In other words, the first spouse to die, whatever they didn't use, it goes over to the second spouse, and so they can use that remaining to try to eliminate any estate taxes or lower estate taxes.
Yeah. And what I really, one thing I think it's important to highlight is that doesn't happen automatically.
Right.
In order to, what do you have to do in order to capture the portability?
Yes, you've got to make that election. You've got to fill out a Form 706 for the state. And so talk about why that's so important.
Well, that's really the only way to capture portability. And I think, it's wouldn't apply to everyone. Obviously, this is an estate tax reduction strategy, but if you have a taxable estate, then on the first to die, you would want to make that election on the 706 when that estate tax return is filed. Right. Also, if you think your estate may be close to the size that it would be taxable for estate tax purposes, you would still file a 706, even though it's not required, just to capture portability.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great point, because people just naturally think, hey, I don't have a taxable estate, or I guess really this is their executor thinking this. And so they just don't do it. But there can still be some huge benefit to that in terms of portability, because those assets are going to continue to grow, right? And so we still, for the surviving spouse, want to take advantage of that portability and the ability to minimize estate taxes. And you might talk about this just very briefly. We are currently in a time where we're not sure what's going to happen with the estate tax threshold, and so if that ever changes, that's another place where portability could be really important.
Right. The current tax law has a sunset date, and when that happens, the lifetime exemption amount could drop, making this even more meaningful. I also before we move up too much further, wanted to hit on, we've talked a lot about the basis step up, the step up in cost basis on the date of death, in which, your cost basis gets stepped up to your market value as of your date of death, mitigating all that capital gains tax. One of the reasons that electing portability is really beneficial is to capture that cost basis step up. At the death of the first spouse to die, generally, and in Texas with community property, all the assets get a step up in basis. But you could have another 10 years go by. At the death of the second to die, there's another basis step up. So electing portability can be useful from that standpoint. Whereas with the bypass trust or the credit shelter trust, you do not have the basis step up on the assets that funded that trust at the death of the first spouse.
Sure. So essentially, you're getting with a portability, you're getting that step up in basis both when the first spouse dies and when the second spouse dies.
Right.
And it sounds like we're saying that the bypass trust is no longer useful because of portability. And one thing I do want to highlight is that it still can be a useful tool. One particular scenario I'm thinking about is when a surviving spouse remarries. Sometimes they feel an obligation to leave something to their spouse that they've remarried with. And, it might be a situation where then the kids don't get anything or receive less than, they may have. And so one of the benefits still of the bypass trust is that you can still direct where at least the first spouse's assets are going. I mean, in that way, if there is a remarriage, you can make sure that those kids are still going to receive what the first spouse intended.
Right. That's a great point. And you're not cutting out your surviving spouse either. Right. Either. Generally, the trusts are written with provisions that, the surviving spouse is the primary beneficiary for the remainder of his or her life, at which point you maintain control over those assets, ensuring that your children are not cut out of your estate plan inadvertently.
Right.
And there's one more I'm glad you mentioned, is the bypass trust completely irrelevant? I'd say the use case is a lot less, but completely irrelevant, I don't know. We talked about the assets that are funded into the credit shelter bypass trust, they don't get a step up in basis. But one benefit is, if you elect portability, that amount is fixed at your date of death. It doesn't change. Whereas the investments that remain in the estate plan, they're going to continue to grow. So the bypass trust can be an effective tool from that standpoint, where the assets funded into the trust continue to grow. All that growth remains excluded from the estate at the death of the second spouse to die. Right. So there may be a use case in which, if you accumulate a significant amount of wealth early in life, maybe this could be a good provision to have written into your estate plan, such that if there are 20 or 30 years of growth, and the estate tax rate is higher than the capital gains rate, there may be a situation in which the bypass trust could be useful in excluding all that growth from the estate at the death of the second spouse to die.
I'm glad you said that. I think that's an excellent point. And I think this is another good reminder, these sort of little scenarios of why it's so important to work with a great attorney and CPA, because they are really going to be able to fine tune, what your situation is to what documents they draft. And similarly with us as wealth advisors, we can help point you in the right direction. Ultimately, it'll be drafted by an attorney, but those little cases where you can have a huge advantage if you go a certain direction, I think is really important.
Yep, 100% agree.